Immigration is the process of moving from your home country to another country. The reasons a person might want to immigrate to another country are numerous. Job opportunities, family reunification, or they simply don't feel safe in their own home anymore. Throughout the world, most people can immigrate to another country without many problems. Sometimes, though, their new home does not welcome them with open arms. In 1871, hundreds of white and Hispanic Americans descended on what is now known as Old Chinatown with the sole intention of killing as many Chinese immigrants as possible. Of the 19 people who lost their lives that day, 15 were hanged in the streets. To put the loss into perspective, it amounted to over 10% of the Chinese population in Los Angeles at the time, which totaled 172 before the massacre. A few sources have even stated that this was the largest mass lynching in American history. In the years that led up to the Los Angeles Chinese massacre, tensions had been rising between the communities. Despite the Chinese immigrants making up such a small portion of the Los Angeles population as a whole, some white inhabitants were said to resent the growing number of Chinese immigrants. In 1863, the state legislature even passed a law that made it illegal for Asians to testify against whites in court. That made for an extreme power imbalance since crimes against Asian individuals could go relatively unpunished if there wasn't enough evidence without witness testimony from the victim of the crime. In 1868, 3 years before the massacre, the United States entered into an agreement known as the Burlingame Treaty, which laid out conditions for immigration for Chinese citizens. Of the Chinese individuals that moved into the United States at the time, most were men who planned to stay temporarily for work purposes. In Los Angeles, the community of less than 200 was made up of 80% men. In the 1850s and 60s, the population of Los Angeles was around 4,000. There were roughly 11,000 people in the entire Los Angeles County. Los Angeles at the time was somewhat of a frontier that had a disproportionately high amount of violence, lynchings in particular, for the population and size of the city. In the days leading up to the massacre, a violent dispute had broken out between two Chinese immigrant groups, the Hong Chau and the Nin Yung. That allegedly began over the abduction of a Chinese woman named Yat Ho. Due to there being only 2 women for every 8 men, most of the women acted as sex workers, either willingly or unwillingly. The separate factions often got into altercations about who they deemed were their women. The police were able to keep things relatively peaceful, trying to intervene when possible and sort out issues between the groups where they could, but the supposed abduction of Yat Ho had caused things to bubble over. When a shootout began in the middle of Old Chinatown, Constable Jesus Bilderain was on horseback in the area and went to see what was going on, closely followed by Constable Estevan Sanchez. When they arrived at the scene and attempted to arrest one of the men who had been involved, Bilderain was shot in the shoulder and Sanchez was shot 3 times. Both of the men retreated, with Bilderain being followed by a group of men through the general store. Once he made it to the other side, Bilderain blew his police whistle and propped himself up on a post. He no longer had his revolver as he had dropped it when his shoulder was shot. The men following him shot in his direction a few more times before running back into the store. Gunfire continued between the men inside and other officers at the scene, with one citizen who tried to help the police being killed in the process. Once the shots ceased, City Marshal Frank Baker ordered men to stand watch by the general store and the house connected to it, with the express instructions to not let any Chinese men out. Other guards were placed at various posts across Old Chinatown with the same instructions. Soon, a crowd began to gather as news of the fight spread. As more and more people heard about Robert Thompson's death, the citizen who had died in the crossfire, a rumor sparked that Chinese immigrants are killing whites wholesale. As the hours passed, more and more people gathered on the boundaries of Old Chinatown. It began with Ah Wing. When he was searched, Marshal Baker found a 4-barreled sharpshooter with 1 load out. Baker took the gun but let Wing go. Not long after, Wing was captured again, now possessing a hatchet. Constable Emil Harris was tasked with taking Wing to the county jail. He did so with the help of another officer. While they were walking Wing along Arcadia and Main Street, a group of men began following them. They were intercepted at the intersection of Main and Spring. Wing and Harris were taken, and Wing was led to Tomlinson's corral. He was then hanged from the gate's crossbeam. Harris was let go. Meanwhile, the men that were guarding the initial store where the gunfight occurred saw the door open. Augustus Cates, one of the appointed guards, told the men inside to close the door. They didn't follow the orders, so one of the guards was instructed to fire his gun at the door. It then quickly closed, and the men standing guard moved further back. A while later, the door opened again and 3 shots were fired out of it before it quickly closed. Some time passed, and a Chinese man made a break for it out of one of the buildings. He made it no more than 10 feet out the door before he was shot down in a hail of bullets. That was later determined to be a man called Ah Cut. The next casualty was a man inside one of the buildings who drew back a curtain and looked out onto the street. He was met with a string of bullets through the window. Over the next few hours, there was a continuous exchange of gunfire between the Chinese immigrants in the building and the mob waiting outside. A group of men then used a ladder to climb on top of the main building. The group began shooting at Chinese men who were in the building's backyard and then started trying to break in through the roof before firing into the rooms inside. That caused the occupants to try and escape. One escapee was shot and tried to crawl back inside. One man in the group, J.C. Cox, offered to go inside and bring him out. He tried to set a room alight in the process by throwing an alcohol-soaked ball inside that he lit on fire. Then he turned his attention to the wounded man and brought him out onto the street. Once the mob saw that Cox had successfully made his way inside, they grew brave enough to do the same. They quickly came across 2 men who were dragged out. Further doors were broken down, and the Chinese men inside were captured by the mob. At that stage, Harris, Marshal Baker, and 2 other law enforcement officers were on the scene. They gave individual groups instructions to take the Chinese immigrants in their possession to the county jail. Harris later claimed this is what he believed was going to happen, even though he likely saw Ah Wing's fate at the corral. While some of the groups did in fact take the Chinese immigrants to jail safely, others led them straight to either Tomlinson's corral or John Galler's wagon shop, where they were hanged. There were still some good men who attempted to stop the mob from killing these men, though. One group rescued 4 Chinese immigrants near the corral who would have likely been hanged as well. Another police officer, Constable Billy Sands, rescued another 4. Sheriff Burns spoke to the gathered crowd shortly after 9 p.m. and requested that 25 volunteers come forward to help guard the remaining buildings where Chinese immigrants were held up until the morning. Despite his plea, the individuals that tried to run outside were shot by men waiting for them. Those captured were beaten and tortured. Once dawn broke and the severity of the scene became clear, dead Chinese men were found hanging in 3 separate locations in Los Angeles. One of the victims had his finger chopped off as someone wanted a diamond ring he had on. That same man was also hanged and left up without his pants on. Sadly that day, the majority of the men who lost their lives had nothing to do with the conflict that sparked the violence. Dae Ki, Ah Wah, Ho Hing, Lo Hei, Ah Wan, Wing Chi, and Wan Fu were all cooks. Tong Wan was a talented musician, and Ah Long made cigars. Dr. Jean Tong was a physician. An inquest was launched into the events that occurred. It lasted 4 days and saw hundreds of witnesses brought in for questioning. Once the inquest concluded, Dr. Tong's widow lodged a complaint, blaming one of the Chinese gang leaders for inciting and participating in the massacre that killed her husband. The man accused, Tong Yu, was taken into evidence, but when a grand jury looked over the allegations against him, they found there was not enough evidence to back up Mrs. Tong's complaints. Despite the vast amount of people who played a role in the atrocities that took place that day, few were actually tried. When 10 of those men were brought to trial, 8 were convicted of manslaughter and handed prison terms at San Quentin, but none of the men would serve their sentences due to alleged legal technicalities. As the years passed, Los Angeles quickly forgot about the massacre. It wasn't even mentioned in 1871's year-end recap. In 2001, a plaque was presented at the Chinese American Museum. It explains in both English and Mandarin the events of the Los Angeles Chinese massacre and stands as a memorial to the lives lost. Something that can hopefully serve as a reminder that just because someone is an immigrant doesn't mean they're a criminal. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.